Welcome to the Reach Australia podcast. My name's Peter Blanche. It's great to have you with us. Reach Australia exists. It has a vision to see, Australia reach for Christ. We know that Jesus loves his church, and to reach this country, we're going to need thousands of healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches. And you clicked on another episode of the Reach Australia podcast because part of the Australians that we are looking to reach in this country are Vietnamese Australians. And I've got with me today Doan. Welcome, Nam.
Thanks, Pete.
It is great to have you with us. Now, Nam is himself a second generation Vietnamese Australian. He's got a passion to see as many of those, as many people in this country, including Vietnamese Australians, won for Christ. Now, Nam, tell us a bit about yourself. Where's church for you? You're involved with the Gospel Coalition Australia. Give us that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, currently I'm serving as the Youth and Young Adults Minister at the Yagoona and Condell Park Anglican Church. Doing that for a couple of months now. I'm also a committee member of the TGCA, sort of the Asia network of that. I've been doing that for a couple of years now as well.
That's fantastic. Now, can you give us a feel of just how many Vietnamese people Vietnamese Australians do we have?
Yeah, based on the 2021 census, we're seeing that there's around 200,000 people who were born in Vietnam who've now moved to Australia.
Okay, first generations. Yep.
First generation, yeah, it's almost 200,000. Of that, though, there's about maybe 130,000 of them who are Australian-born Vietnamese, who have kind of Vietnamese ancestry or who speak a language of Vietnamese at home. Yeah. So it's still a great number.
Quite a large number
absolutely.
of people. Where are they living in Australia? Where are they?
Yeah, I mean, probably to no one's surprise, most of them are either in New South Wales or Victoria. I think those are the two biggest groups. When it comes to New South Wales, it's in the city of Fairfield, the Fairfield LGA, around about 70,000 people are around there. And when it comes to Victoria, we're looking at the Brimbank LGA, about 70,000 people there as well. So great numbers of people.
Great numbers.
Yeah.
There are quite a number of Vietnamese Australians. Who are already here? What's the forecast? What's the forecast for how many are going to be here in the future?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to estimate, but looking kind of back over the last 10 years, we've had about 60,000 people from Vietnam actually come to Australia. These are sort of different to your first generation Vietnamese who came in the 70s and 80s due to the Vietnam War. The ones who are coming in the last 10 years, they're obviously born in Vietnam, but they're sort of your younger professionals coming over here to study, coming over here to find work, maybe bring their families over as well. But this particular group is a little interesting because they're born in Vietnam, they're younger, but they also can speak English as well. They have a bit of Western influences in them from Vietnam. And so reaching that particular group is interesting. So they're sort of like your kind of 1.5 kind of thing as well.
No, that's really exciting. Now, why is it so important that we reach them?
I guess it's important to reach them because I guess it's like any other cultural group or ethnic group. They need to hear the gospel. There's so many people in Vietnam who have never heard about Jesus. Christianity doesn't make up a huge number in Vietnam, and so there's a huge urgent need for people to hear the gospel of Jesus, both whether they stay in Australia or they go back. If they do go back, it's a great opportunity to bring the gospel back with them as well. And if they do stay here, to get connected to a church community. But there's so many lost people in the Vietnamese culture who don't know Jesus. And so my heart is to see them be saved, and through that to go back to Vietnam and see their people and their families be saved as well. Yeah,
that's right. The realities of heaven and hell just impress upon us for every Australian.
No doubt.
We need to reach them as quickly and urgently as we can.
Yeah.
Now, can you give us a feel for reaching, say, the first generations, people who have migrated from Vietnam? How are we going at reaching them? Yeah.
When it comes to the first generation Vietnamese, obviously, when they come over here, they sort of trying to fit into the Australian culture. So they sort of feel a bit out of place. I think one of the things that's been really important in reaching first generation Vietnamese is actually a sense of community. That's where the church is such a vital part in reaching first generation, because when they meet a Christian who goes to a Vietnamese church, they feel like he's someone who gets me. He's someone who knows my language, my heart language, my culture. So actually having them reach out to them and making connections there is a huge part in seeing them come to faith. In my experience, growing up in the Vietnamese church, having first generations come there, kind of sitting for a meal, sitting in a service, meeting mums and dads who are like them. They really feel like, wow, like Christianity is just sort of like doing family. And that's a huge barrier to overcome for them. I mean, like sort of it overcomes that barrier for them.
Yes.
And it's a great way to kind of introduce the gospel to them as well. So sense of community is really big for them. Yeah.
It's an interesting observation, because what we're hearing from every group of Australians that we're trying to reach who are migrants, come from overseas, the community aspect really is so critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, how can is it possible for people who don't speak Vietnamese to do community well, to reach those first generation?
It's possible. Yeah, hard, but possible. I think one of the things that for first generation, if you're talking about first generation Vietnamese, is that they do want to, I guess, kind of bond with people who are like them.
Yeah.
One of the advantages that you could have is actually, if you know of this first generation, actually ask them to sort of lead your church into connecting with people in the community as well. They would love that. They would love to see people who are like them to come into the church. Yeah. So if you had contacts there and you asked them to come on board and help our church know how to reach them, that's a huge plus as well. So it can be done. Yeah, definitely hard, but definitely can be.
That's excellent. What about reaching second generation, the children of first generation people? How do we reach second generation?
Yeah, actually reaching them is also a great way to reach their parents as well.
Absolutely.
The first generation. But when it comes to the second generation, like those who are born in Australia, in some ways they're not all that different to reaching your typical Australian born, whoever that might be. They struggle with the same things. They ask the same kinds of questions. But when it comes to second generation, one of the things that's sort of particular to them as the Vietnamese is that there's a good chance they come from a Buddhist family. Buddhism makes up probably the biggest number of Vietnamese people. And so one of the things that I've experienced in my life in the Vietnamese church is that when you're trying to reach a Vietnamese second generation, one of the things you're going to have to really help them wrestle with and grapple with is that when they hear about the gospel and they want to come to Jesus in faith, they have to ask the question, what does that mean for my family?
Yes.
Where does that put me and my family? Like, am I on the outs with my family? Will I feel a sense of rejection or shame from my family? And for a lot of second generation, those are sort of the questions they have to ask. And there's a lot of confusion over that. There's a lot of conflict for them as well. Because on the one hand, the reality of heaven and hell in Jesus is real. But on the other hand, so is family. And so they're sort of stuck in that middle. But if they do come to faith and know Jesus, that's actually a great step in seeing their parents come to faith as well by introducing that into the family. Yeah.
How do we help those? Because it's second generation Vietnamese Christians, people who've come to Christ. There are significant, for want of a better word, identity issues there. Going, okay, I've come to Australia, so I'm living in an Australian country, not in Vietnam. My parents have come from Vietnam. The culture, I've got two cultures genuinely, but also I've got Christianity, which is overculture.
The dominant culture.
I've got to serve Christ first. What are some of the issues that in following those who are second generation Vietnamese people who have come to Christ? How do we follow them up well in the midst of all those issues they're facing? Yeah,
a great question. I think for some of the stories that I've heard and people that I've walked alongside, one of the key things that's helped second generation come to faith and really grow and mature is actually the church community. Reason being is because a lot of them have had to sort of ask those questions about, what does my Buddhist family think about this? Will they cast me out? That's where the church family is such a big vital part of their Christian faith. So I think one of the core gospel imperatives is not only what it means for the individual to become a Christian, but what does it mean for them to be enfolded into a church community? So some of the guys I grew up with, when they felt like they were not sort of received well from their family, their church was actually their family. The Bible studies during the week, going to church on Sundays, eating meals, they really felt a sense of belonging and acceptance. They really felt invited. And so I think one of the key things is actually giving them a connect to a really good, healthy church, discipling them, teaching them the basis of Christianity, what it means to be a part of a family. That's a great way to support them during the time when they're sort of kind of wrestling with family and sort of identity issues.
Because they still need to honour their parents, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, not at the cost of disobeying or being ungodly towards God. And so helping them, they can help each other if they're in that space. Now look, it's important to think not just how to follow them up. I want to go back to seeing them come to Christ in the first place. let's think again here now about the second generation Vietnamese Australians.
Yep.
What are we seeing that's getting good traction in seeing them come to Christ?
Yeah. Something that we're seeing good traction is looking at, I guess, the church is always a big part of it. Having a second generation congregation, I think, is really, really key. Okay. Looking at a second generation church, that's where your typical second generation Vietnamese kind of can walk in and feel like, okay, these are people who are kind of like me. They look like me. They know what I'm going through. They know the identity crisis that I feel with my family, my culture. I think having them make them feel kind of really welcome in that church environment is key. I think that's where we're seeing a lot of traction, is in that Vietnamese church.
So here you've got a Vietnamese church which has a Vietnamese speaking
congregation,
and you also have a second generation, and that's getting good traction.
Yep.
There will be churches who are listening to this across the country who don't have a Vietnamese speaking congregation, but they have is a number of Vietnamese people in their community, and all they have is an English speaking congregation. How do those churches get good traction with, say, second generation Vietnamese?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm on the majority of this, but not just bringing like second generations in, but also seeing them grow and mature. I think one of the things that needs to happen is, particularly for the first generation Vietnamese church, like the parents and the grandparents generation, I think for them to sort of release authority and kind of release their young people to kind of become sort of their own independent church, I think is so important. One of the things in the Vietnamese church is that they're so big on family. You want to see family come together in church, so you've got your first and second generations come together, which is great. I grew up in that. I know that world. It's so good to be a part of that. But I think long term, if you really want to kind of sustain growth in the second generation, the first is going to have to release them, kind of let them go, do church their own way, become independent, kind of releasing authority and letting them do church their own way. That's hard, because for the first generation, they kind of want to kind of hold on to their heritage and hold on to their language and their culture, which I totally get. But for a second generation, it's really hard to sort of balance between those two worlds. Knowing that they've grown up in Australia, that's probably more their dominant culture. It's the way they think, it's the language that they speak. And so if the first generation can let their young people go, release them, let them have their own church, do things their own way, I think that's a great way to not only keep Australian-born Vietnamese, but also allow them to reach their friends as well in Australia's own culture. I think that's a huge step moving forward.
Can you give me a story of either a first generation or a second generation Vietnamese person coming to Christ?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good mate of mine. I'll just call him Frank. Frank came from an all Buddhist family, really strong Buddhist. Every single person in the family is. But when he came to faith in Jesus, one of the things that he knew he had to kind of grapple with was, again, like, what does this do for me and my family? How do I break the news? And there was one day that his father found out that he had become Christian. And remember, his father sat him down and said to Frank, your grandfather is Buddhist, I'm a Buddhist, your mum's a Buddhist. Are you going to break the family chain? And if you're a kid in the family and you hear your father say that, are you going to break the family chain? Having that kind of weight of responsibility of family on you was so hard for him to hear. And then on top of that, Frank's mum one day actually called the grandmother and said to the grandmother, do you know what happened to your grandson? He became a Christian. And that really disappointed the grandmother. And so he had the whole weight of family sort of against him. And it was really hard for him to know kind of where he belongs with his family. Things like going to church was hard for him as well. When his parents would ask him, where are you going on Sundays? He'd have to say, well, I'm just going to hang out with my friends. He knew that if he said church, what that would do for the family dynamics. And so there was a lot of obstacles for Frank to overcome. But that's where the church was really supportive of him and gave him a home. Yeah.
I kind of want to say you should have just said, absolutely, I'm going to stop being Buddhist and be Christian, which is the right answer, but doing that sensitively, because that whole family needs to hear that actually Buddhism is actually a dead end. And the gutsiness to say Christ is first and he's first in my life is implicitly saying he needs to be first in your life as well, and they need to hear it with that clarity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, look, I've even got a story of Vietnamese person coming to Christ. So it was
Absolutely.
the first generation. I was a pastor in Wagga, and Na, if you're listening, it'd be great to hear from you. But it was Romans 1. It was fascinating.
Right.
We were doing a sermon series on Romans 1. They were recently come to the country. They came along to church, and she was reading Romans. We were doing Romans 1. She was reading Romans 1, and actually for her it was partly what I would call explanatory power. She read the Romans 1 and went, this explains Vietnam. This explains my home country, why it is the way it is. And it was that explanatory power that actually brought a lot of interest for her.
Wow.
And that's in a country town, right? It's fantastic. They
Yeah.
are in the cities, but there are Vietnamese people everywhere, and they are lovely, and they need to come to Christ. Now, what are some of the stumbling blocks that people who are trying, or everyone is trying to reach Vietnamese people, and if they're in your community, you ought to be trying to reach them. What are some of the stumbling blocks that we can accidentally put in front of them that can be blockages for them taking Jesus seriously?
Yeah, I think when it comes to that, another story that I have, I think maybe might illustrate that. There was a friend of mine that I had many years ago, and she was coming to our church, looking to explore Christianity. She also came from a really strongly Buddhist family as well. And she came to that point where she knew she had to make a decision. And she kind of made decisions like, okay, if I'm going to become a Christian, I'm going to have to say no to my mum and my grandma, say no to sort of praying to the ancestors and offering food sacrifices. And she had to kind of weigh that question, what that would mean for her. At the end of the day, she decided not to become a Christian. I think it would have sacrificed too much. I use that story because I think one of the things that we need to be aware of when it comes to reaching Australian-born Vietnamese is, I think, helping them grapple with the theological and the practical implications of becoming Christian. Theologically, what does it mean to sort of have my new identity in Jesus? My identity is not an Aussie or a Vietnamese or my family. My identity is in Christ, and what that actually means for them. I think holding on to that is really key. But second of all, like, what does it actually mean practically? Like, day to day, what does it mean for me to have my identity in Christ when it comes to my family? One of the mistakes that we did with her was like sort of telling her, you just need to say no to your family. Just reject your family outright. Don't do these practices, and just kind of, be firm with that. But I think that didn't work well with her family, who was really strong. So I think we need to kind of help her work through, just bit by bit, what things can you do, what things can't you do, what can you participate in, what things you can't participate in. And helping her think, how can I love my family? How can I honor my family, but still show Jesus to my family in different ways as well? And so I think those are some really key things, and that actually requires us to kind of walk alongside the Australian-born Vietnamese, not just to see them come to faith and sort of let them go, but kind of disciple them, walk with them, thinking through those issues bit by bit. I think that's a great way to help them through.
Yeah, no, that's in some way, once someone comes to Christ, walking with them through that.
Yeah.
But say the moment before, so before they've actually come to put their faith in Jesus, are there any stumbling blocks that we need to be aware of food issues or cultural practices that really, anyone who's trying to reach Vietnamese, it's so handy if they are aware of that?
Yeah, I think, some of the things I've mentioned before, but things like family and family religion, one's place in their family as well. And that's where it's different with sort of, I guess, the Western mindset growing up. I guess the Western mindset is very much sort of individualism. I can make my own choice. I can kind of live my own life and make my own decisions. In the Vietnamese culture, it's not necessarily the case. It's not like you're sort of your own independent person. You can make your own decisions and affect no one. Every young second generation Vietnamese person knows that their decision affects family. And so there's a huge pressure for them. So again, I think helping them understand that and working with
navigating that.
Even navigating that.
Bringing Christ to them in the first place.
What does Christ say about family and family allegiance? And how does Jesus speak into that as well? We know that Jesus speaks about, like if you don't hate your father and mother and hate your own life, then you're not worthy to be my disciple. That's well and good, but what does it mean for them? What does it mean to, in a sense, reject father and mother or hate father and mother? Those are huge words in Vietnamese culture. And I remember hearing those words in a Vietnamese church and how hard it is for parents to hear that, for their children to say, like, do you reject me? Do you reject all that I've done for you? Do you reject our sacrifices? Those are things that for us, we have to hear that. And knowing how to love our parents well, particularly if you come from a Buddhist family or a non-Christian family. Because when you become a Christian, you want to see your family become a Christian as well. You don't want to sort of outright reject them. You want to see them come to faith. So, how do you do that? How do you love them well?
It sounds to me, Naam, that there's challenge and opportunity. In some ways, you're saying helping them count the cost before they come to Christ, which is biblical. But often in Australia, sometimes people come to Christ and they count the cost later, maybe.
Yeah.
But in this case, we're saying actually help them count the cost early. The opportunity in that is going, just see how great Jesus is. That He is the pearl of great price. Sell everything you have for go and follow him. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, helps them see that there is genuine cost to rejecting their parents' way of life, or if they aren't Christian. But actually, that's in some ways respectful and loving to them as well, because they need to come to Christ too.
Absolutely. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying before about how do we reach the first generation. That's actually one of the great ways to do it, is actually through their kids. And when the kids are living at home and they're sort of kind of growing the fruits of the Spirit, showing Jesus, speaking about Jesus at home. It may not always come across well at the start, but I think for parents, when they see their kids change, that's a really visible witness to sort of the transformational power of the gospel in the kids' lives. And kind of hopefully, in God's grace, it actually make a really good impression on the parents as well. And I've seen in my experience, the kids actually bring their parents to church, connect them with the community. You know, hey mum, hey dad, here's my pastor, and here's other uncles and aunties in the church, and they kind of get connected that way. It's a great way to kind of see the whole family come to faith.
And I can just see, isn't it, that although it's difficult and they've got to navigate that space well, what it actually says to their mum and dad is, gee, Jesus is that important that I'm willing, even though I love you dearly and love our family, and I enjoy Vietnamese culture, Jesus is genuinely the king. And you need to understand how critically important he is. We're just going to take a quick break now, but we're going to listen to Quan. Quan is a Christian. He's a Vietnamese Christian. He's in Melbourne and he's very keen to see Vietnamese people reached in Melbourne. He's going to tell us a bit more about how to do that well.
Hey guys, it's Quan. Why am I passionate about reaching Vietnamese-born Australians or Asian Australians in general? Friends, in the most recent census, we saw a large number of Vietnamese-speaking people in just the west side of Melbourne, in the Brimbank Council. The numbers were close to around 36,000 people or so. There is nowhere enough churches or ministry focused in reaching this particular people group. And let me tell you the story of what it looks like for me to grow up in the church. For me to have grown up in the church, I have these two friends, they are brothers. Eventually, as I came to faith, they walked a different path. They stopped going to church. They just completely leave the faith. And what was sad about it was also when I drove past a local train station. Here I saw both of them being stopped and pulled over by cops. It was really sad because not only that they have walked away from the church community, from the faith, but to see their lives being affected in a very negative sense. That's the pain that I felt and experienced. That is the longing that I have for people to know Jesus. Not just that, but also see how God could shape and change their lives now as part of eternity as well. But here also the opportunities that I see. I see two opportunities. One is the partnership that could be and hopefully would be possible between the church that I'm hoping to plant, but also with the Vietnamese churches around. I have my mum who is going to a Vietnamese church. I hope and pray that she would be able to pastor it until the Lord calls her home, or unless the Lord Jesus returns earlier than that. And what I long to see here is also her friends, Vietnamese-speaking people in this area, be reached by the gospel. And not only that, from here, that they also have their friends and their children. So my prayer is that they would be compelled by the gospel and trust in Jesus and also want the same for their children. Therefore, not only just Vietnamese congregations speaking Vietnamese and reaching Vietnamese speaking people, but a partnership with English speaking people reaching Vietnamese second generation, third generation who live in Australia. That's my first hope. And the other one is that the advantage of people who are much like myself, grow up in Australia with a very Western upbringing. We are educated in a very Western society. But at the same time, culturally, we are brought up also as Vietnamese or as Eastern oriented people who are very communal, who think differently to the Australian culture. What the opportunity here is, it helps us to actually be able to be understanding of both worlds. And I think this is a great opportunity for the gospel to go forth again. Perhaps overseas missionaries, perhaps reaching indigenous communities with the gospel here, because people can understand and have kind of grown up and understand what cross-cultural living looks like already. That's what I see. That's why I'm so passionate. Much prayers are needed, and to God be the glory. Bye for now.
No, I think something that I'd love to hear you give us some insight into is sometimes in Australia, when we try and seek to save people, we just have this inbuilt assumption, which is completely wrong, that people don't want to actually engage with spiritual Christian things.
Yeah.
And we can just kind of self-sabotage any conversation we might have or any work we might do because we just assume people aren't interested. I think that's completely false, that people
same.
are far more interested. But Vietnamese people, is religion, is Christianity, spiritual things, something that's high on their agenda to talk about? Or is it this something that they're really looking to avoid?
Yeah, good question. If you're talking about the first generation, Vietnamese, like my parents' generation, they're incredibly spiritual, incredibly spiritual. In Vietnam, there's all kinds of religions and spiritualities, really dark forces that people kind of tap into and they understand, and they bring that over to Australia as well. So though they may not be familiar with Christian lingo and Christian language, they understand things like whether it be worship or prayer or God or spiritual forces, demons. They know those kinds of things. They've experienced some of those things in Vietnam as well. So that's not foreign to them as well. And if you're an Australian born, like who grew up in that family, you probably would have heard some of that as well. Frank, for example, when he came to faith, he was very familiar with the idea of worship, of prayer, of sacrifice. That's what a Buddhist family does. And so I don't think it's out of the realm possibility to actually come up and actually approach them, talk to them. I think they're very, very much in that space. Maybe the language that we use obviously needs to be kind of catered to them, but most definitely, they're into that kind of
That's excellent, because I think we keep needing to hear that people are far more willing to engage and we are often willing to talk.
Yeah, most definitely, And actually kind of like maybe touching on some of those real big points about, because in Vietnamese culture, when it comes, I guess, their sort of the religions in Vietnam, they really believe in the power of the power of their gods or power of like demons and evil forces like that. Helping them to see that Jesus is actually the one who has power over evil and over darkness and over all the gods. He is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Helping them see that Jesus is the one who's king over all that and has power. I think that can bring great peace and comfort to those who are really struggling with that, who've had to deal with that as well. I think that's a great opportunity, a great open door to share Jesus with them as well.
That's great. I'm hearing what you're saying, and I can easily imagine myself applying that when I've got, say, a next door neighbour or somebody in the sporting club that my kids are in, or whatever, some kind of personal relationship with a Vietnamese family, first or second generation. But I'm interested also in seeing not just the personal evangelism happen, but in some ways, for want of a better word, the bulk evangelism. Is there churches or groups of people, things that are happening that are seeing conversions in the Vietnamese community, which is not just the ones and twos through personal, but either course-based evangelism or event-based evangelism, something that's seeing 10s and 20s and bulk lots of people getting converted.
It's a sad reality that when it comes to the first generation or the Vietnamese church, courses don't really are placed in the Vietnamese church. There's no sort of your Christianity Explored or Christianity Explained kind of courses happening there. It may be due to other translations or things like that.
Is that a cultural thing, or is it just a lack of resources in this space?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. In all honesty, I think I don't think there's much of the. If there is a Vietnamese translation of it, I don't think they've made it accessible to the Vietnamese church as well. I think that's one part that needs to change.
So that's critical, obviously, for first generation Vietnam. To be
able to get their hands on that kind of material, I think would really help. But also, it's never really been their kind of MO in terms of bringing like a big number of Vietnamese people to come to faith. The thing that I've seen the most actually is not through like your welcome lunches or your coursework. It's actually like your big events. And this is where the Vietnamese community is such a big part. They love your big events, your Christmases, your Easters, your church picnics and your barbecues. It is a golden opportunity to bring people in because, as I said before, they love community. And they'll love it more if they knew that there were people like them who attended it. So if you're a Australian-born Vietnamese, like a second generation, and you've got parents who want to get connected, that is a great opportunity. So I've seen like things like Christmas and Easter. I've seen big numbers of people come to not only come to church, but even following that, they've actually stayed in church because they've got connected. Yes. So they go to Bible study groups. They talk to the pastor about what it means to be a Christian. They talk to other Christian men and women in the church, what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to read the Bible. So I think those are the great things to do. It'd help if there was a course they can go through and teach them what it means to be a Christian, the basics of that. But those are where we've seen a big number of Vietnamese people come to faith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm hearing, again, challenge and opportunity here. There's the community aspect, because they've left their home country, they've come to Australia, they're hungry for this.
Yeah.
It's an easy way to interact with Vietnamese people. The danger, though, might be that we just leave it there. They love coming to our big events. They love the community stuff we can put on, and we actually never get around to challenging them with the truth of the gospel.
Yeah.
Do you see churches falling into that era where they're actually, all they're doing for Vietnamese people in Australia is community, and that's all it's done?
Yeah. I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen where they will come to those big events and they'll sort of get integrated into church life, but sort of for them, Christianity then just becomes sort of this is sort of a new hat that I wear now.
Yes.
And they never really maybe comes to that moment of like clarity and that moment of conversion where it actually becomes real for them. They're sort of just like, I've gone from being a Buddhist or a non-Christian, now I'm just going to church and I just go to Bible study. The things that Christians do, without actually coming to that critical moment.
No, this is so critical for everyone to hear, isn't it? That it is possible to have. You need the clarity of your church, don't you? To go, we actually want to see people converted, not just people coming regularly to our stuff. Because I'm hearing that Vietnamese people who are loving the community life of a church, they will come regularly to stuff. Yeah. But you may think, oh, they're part of our church, but they're actually not converted yet. They're just culturally involved in what might be just the religion, the community of this religion.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons for that is some of those who are coming into the churches for the first time, they may be coming from either a Buddhist background or even like, let's say, a Catholic background, or even just like a nominal atheist background, where a lot of the Vietnamese culture is about doing works. So if you're a Buddhist, you're all about living a certain way, doing certain things. If you go to a Catholic church, maybe for them it's all about like, church is something you got to tick off the box and do certain things. So when they come to maybe your evangelical church, it's sort of the same mentality for them. Oh, I just got to go to church, or I just got to help out with the food. I just got to go to Bible study. If I do the right things, then I'm a Christian. And so for a lot of times, they kind of seep into that, where it just becomes sort of a name or a tag that they wear, without actually coming to that reality of what it means to follow Jesus.
Because this, to me, feels like the fundamental error that many churches or leaders could actually accidentally make, is the call of the gospel to come to a clear point of conversion can be left behind. And they need to be very clear on.
Because and sometimes the reason is because we're happy to see them come to church. We're happy to see them become members, and like we'll settle with that. We're great with that, but we don't want to kind of push into that a little bit more. kind of really challenge them. Like, so what does it mean to follow Jesus? And so, yeah.
So where's the point of clarity? So part of what I'm hearing from you, Nam, is to feel like, okay, some of the Buddhist background, obviously the worksy background, the gospel will cause will cause necessary offence. That Jesus is Lord, and if he's not your Lord currently, then you need to turn around from that, and that can be quite offensive. You've got to actually change your whole life around and treat him as the king. Where are the points where we actually need to make it very clear that no, Christianity is precisely and potentially offensively different to Vietnamese thinking and culture?
I think it starts with the doctrine of grace. I think helping them understand what it means to be saved by grace. In the Vietnamese culture, it's easy to think that I'm saved or I get to God or I get to heaven by my works. That's so entrenched in our thinking. I think the grace is really lost in there as well. We'll say things like, Jesus saved you and Jesus loved you and you're saved by grace, but I think we're really getting really getting a handle on what that actually means to be saved by grace. And that is, it's not by your works, it's not by your what you perform and how you look to the community. It's that you're saved apart from your works. You're actually saved by the work of Jesus. And what does that actually mean for you? It means that you don't have to perform or put on a show. But at the same time, as you said before, grace does save us, but it also radically transforms the way that we live as well. What does it mean to live in allegiance to Jesus as my King? It will shape my works. It will shape what I do, but not because I'm trying to earn something, not because I'm trying to gain a standing with God. It's because I've left those things behind. Those things are sort of rubbish to me, as Paul says, and now I'm living for Jesus. That means I love my family, I love all those things, but they're not my identity, they're not my idol, they're not my goal. Jesus has become all those things for me. And so helping them kind of wrestle and reason with that is huge. Yeah.
I'm loving this, Nam, because effectively what you're saying, the gospel is the same for any
person.
Absolutely. As we all know, the gospel is the same for any culture. There are particular things here where it rubs against Vietnamese culture, but it's still the same gospel. It's the gospel of grace. So many people are caught up in works. And so many people are caught up in just kind of background religion. And this can easily be Vietnamese people, and they need to hear with clarity the lordship of Christ.
Now, I was speaking about how that is for the first generation Vietnamese, but it kind of also trickles down to the Australian-born second generation Vietnamese as well. A lot of my friends who are sort of born and raised in the church, it's easy for them to sort of go to church with their parents, the parents who maybe just sort of wear the Christian hat but maybe haven't professed faith in Jesus. The same thing happens for their kids. When they go to church, that's all church is. I'm wearing that Christian hat. I go to church because mum and dad do. It's the family thing. I should attend the services. I should go to youth group. And so they kind of go through the motions and the routine of the Christian faith without also making that profession of faith in Jesus as well. They kind of grow up and they get baptized, but again, they're baptized because that's a cultural thing. That's what a good Christian should do, without actually ever really realizing what it means to actually be a Christian. So it's not just a first generation thing, it actually affects the second generation as well. And so in many ways, one affects the other. And so it's not always as clear as you do one thing for one group and one thing for the other. It actually has a huge connection between the two as well. Yeah.
It's actually, there's a clarity thing here for any church or any pastor, shepherd, anyone who's in Christian things, that having clarity around people need to make a clear, definitive decision around following Christ. And whether first or second generation, that needs to be put before them regularly. Now, there are a number of different approaches being taken to reach Australian-born Vietnamese people. Can you tell us what they are and which ones are getting the most traction? I can't say for sure just at the moment whether they're getting a lot of traction, but I think there's maybe some promising signs here. So the church that I'm currently serving at Yagoona and Condell Park Anglican Church, a couple of months ago, they made a huge move, and that is there was a Vietnamese church that was a part of that, and they had your first generation and your second generation Vietnamese worshipping together. The big move that they made is that the first generation actually really empowered and allowed the young people to sort of become independent, kind of do church their own way, sort of getting out from under the parents' authority. I think that's a huge step, in all honesty. I think that's a great way for the Australian-born Vietnamese to sort of do church with their own kind of culture, their own heart language.
They can still be, you know, sort of Vietnamese as much as they want to, but at the same time, they get to express their faith in a way that they get and they understand without having to kind of grapple with sometimes the dueling cultures. But the big step there is actually the first generation allowing the kids to do that. That's not always easy, but I think that's sort of the wave of the future. In order for us to bring in more Australian-born Vietnamese and to see them grow and flourish, I think that's probably where we need to go. And I'm hoping that actually it's a great sign for the future to come. Yeah.
And these are kind of stories in some ways about churches with a Vietnamese congregation.
Yeah.
What about getting traction for those churches, and there'll be lots of these across the country who don't have a Vietnamese congregation? How are they? Have you got any thoughts about churches that are getting traction amongst the Vietnamese community when they don't have that kind of specialisation service?
Yeah, I think that's where things like partnership are so key. I think if you're a church that is sort of in a community area that has a lot of Vietnamese people, but you don't have Vietnamese people in your church, things like reaching out and connecting with other perhaps Vietnamese churches as well and having partnerships with them is big. Knowing how you might be able to do things together in reaching that community. It is hard, like if you're a church that doesn't have Vietnamese people and you're trying to reach them, there's always going to be cultural and language barriers, no doubt about it.
And get help, phone your Vietnamese friends.
Yeah,
right?
exactly right.
Go to church, hear from churches that have them.
Yeah, find out ways to actually do things together. Maybe there are courses that the church can offer in their language, or maybe there are things they can do in their language, but actually doing that together, I think is really key, and actually being open to actually reaching out and doing work with them as well. I think that's a great way to reach the Vietnamese community.
That's excellent. Now, is there, I mean, you've been trying to reach Vietnamese Australians as long as you've been alive, I'm taking it.
Yeah, I think so.
Is there anything you've changed your mind over over these years in trying to reach Vietnamese Australians?
Yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that nothing's changed my mind. Like I still have a heart for the Vietnamese Australians. They still need to hear the gospel. They're still lost and wandering through life without Jesus. And so I want to see them come to faith. I want to see them know Jesus as Lord and Savior. So that mandate hasn't changed at all. I think some of the things I've sort of started to reconsider sort of maybe the best way to do that. I still think there's a great place in our society for a Vietnamese church. And what I mean by that is your first and second generation. I think there's still a great place for them in society. Because one of the things that's so good about them is that they're a great point of contact for a Vietnamese Australian. When they go to a church like that, they kind of feel at home. There are people who are like them. There's an automatic kind of unspoken connection there. There's a great space for them to kind of grow and to meet other Christians as well. But I think one of the things that I've sort of changed my mind on sort of where do you go from there? How do you equip them, train them, empower them for ministry and for gospel living? I think that's where the Vietnamese church sort of needs to maybe shift and change. It may not have to look like your first and second generation church in the one church. It may simply mean like, how do we allow our young people to kind of grow and flourish? And that might mean sort of releasing them, letting them kind of form their own church, or help them connected to another church as well. It may not be Vietnamese in that way, and that's okay, but you're seeing your kids come to faith, and you're seeing their friends come to faith as well. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most important thing. And so that may be the way to go for the future. Yeah.
Naam, it's been excellent having you on. Thanks for being on the Reach Australia podcast.
Thanks, Pete.
One of the things that Naam's has highlighted for us is we are genuinely better together. And the Reach Australia National Conference, which is on this year in May, now's the time to register. It's going to focus on better together. Naam, are you planning to go?
Look, I've never been before, but I absolutely do plan to go.
Yeah, and we're going to love having you there. Why do you want to go this year?
Yeah, I've been really convinced and convicted that, like, as we were saying before, the Vietnamese people, whether you're first or second generation, they need to hear the gospel. There's such a great need here in the Australian community as well. I want to see people of my own culture come to faith. And I think at the Reach Australia conference, the things that you guys do about how to reach people, how to grow churches, how to make them more multiplying, I think those are the things that we need to hear. Those are the things that can really equip the Vietnamese church to do that. So I'm really, really keen to go and kind of get that really plugged in.
Well, I can equip any church to do that, which is what's really exciting, that it's going to really help lots of churches. Come to the Reach Australia National Conference. Now's the time to register. It's in May later this year. Go to the Reach Australia website, reachaustralia.com.au. It's been great to have you listening to this podcast. I'm Peter Blanche.
I'm Naam Doan.
And we'll see you next time.